When Charleston County officials finally opened the sealed court documents from 1850 and 2007, they found something that had been purposely hidden for over 150 years. Among the old record books and property papers was a leather-covered list from the Whitmore estate. It described a slave cabin that should not have existed. The cabin belonged to a woman known only as Deline. Inside were items that broke every law about enslaved people in South Carolina books in 3 languages, including one about legal rules, medical tools of surgical quality, a writing desk with secret compartments, and most shocking of all, a collection of 37 letters written by important Charleston gentlemen. Each letter contained promises, confessions, or threats that could have destroyed reputations across the entire region. The discovery raised a question that archivists could not answer. How had an enslaved woman gained so much power that even after her death, these men paid large amounts of money to keep the documents sealed? What they eventually put together from broken records and witness statements would reveal a story of survival so carefully planned and so brilliantly ruthless that it challenged every comfortable story about slavery in the pre-Civil War South. This is the story of a woman who turned her captivity into power, who weaponized desire, and transformed beauty into the most dangerous currency in Charleston society. Before we go into the shadows of that cabin and the web of secrets Deline built, we need your help to bring more buried truths to light. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your engagement allows us to continue digging up the stories they tried to erase from history. Now let us return to a hot August morning in the South Carolina Lowcountry when everything looked civilized and ordered. But underneath, something was about to break. The Whitmore Plantation covered 200 acres of excellent rice, growing land 20 miles north of Charleston along the Cooper River. The fields stretched to the horizon, divided by complex systems of walls and canals that controlled the water flow essential for growing rice. In 1850, rice was white gold, and the Whitmore family had grown wealthy extracting it from these fever-ridden lowlands through the labor of 206 enslaved people who worked waist deep in water under a sun that could kill. The main house sat on the only high ground for miles, a 3-story building, built in the Georgian style with wide porches, designed to catch whatever breeze might offer relief from the choking humidity. Camellias and azaleas landscaped the grounds, their beauty carefully grown to suggest refinement and order. James Whitmore had inherited the estate from his uncle in 1846. At 42 years old, he was considered one of Charleston's most eligible widowers. His wife had died of yellow fever 3 years after their marriage, leaving him with no children and considerable property. He was handsome in the way Southern gentlemen were expected to be, tall and well-built, with silver threading through his dark hair, and a manner that combined charm with an underlying sense of entitlement that comes from never having been denied anything. He served on multiple boards, hosted expensive dinners for Charleston's elite, and was known for his collection of rare books and his support of the arts. He attended St. Michael's Church every Sunday, sitting in the family pew that had belonged to the Whitmores for 3 generations. To anyone watching from the outside, James Whitmore represented everything the South claimed to stand for: grace, culture, and prosperity built on tradition. The enslaved population lived in 2 separate areas. The field hands occupied rows of weathered cabins near the rice fields, crude structures that flooded during heavy rains and baked like ovens in summer. The house servants lived in somewhat better conditions behind the main house in a long building divided into small rooms. They received slightly better food, slightly better clothing, and worked under the constant watch of the white family and their overseers. But there was one cabin that existed in its own category entirely. It stood alone, positioned between the main house and the quarters, as if occupying some space between the world of the enslaved and the world of the enslavers. From the outside it appeared modest, a single-story wooden structure with a brick foundation and a shingled roof. But those who had been inside spoke of it in whispers. The cabin had plastered walls instead of bare wood, real glass in the windows with curtains that could be drawn for privacy, a fireplace with a proper chimney, and decorative iron. Furniture that belonged in a Charleston townhouse, not a slave dwelling, and most remarkably, a door with a lock. Though whether it locked to keep others out, or to keep the occupant in, no one was entirely certain. Deline had arrived at Whitmore Plantation in the spring of 1848, though arrived was perhaps the wrong word. She had been acquired, purchased at a private sale that James Whitmore conducted in Charleston with a dealer who specialized in what the polite language of the time called fancy girls, women whose primary value lay not in their capacity for physical labor, but in their appearance, their refinement, their suitability for roles that were never openly discussed, but universally understood. The bill of sale listed her as approximately 22 years old and described her coloring as quadroon or possibly octoroon, meaning somewhere between 1/4 and 1/8 African ancestry. Her features were described in language, typically reserved for artworks: classical bone structure, luminous complexion, exceptional grace of movement. The price James Whitmore paid was extraordinary, nearly $4,500, enough to purchase 3 prime field hands. His plantation overseer, a brutal man named Taggart, who had worked rice plantations from the Santee to the Savannah, raised his eyebrows when he learned the amount, but said nothing. He understood what such purchases meant, what role such women were expected to fill. But Deline was not what James Whitmore expected, though it would take him months to realize how deeply he had miscalculated. She was beautiful, yes, heartbreakingly so, with skin the color of polished mahogany and amber mixed together, eyes that seemed to change from green to gold depending on the light, and hair that fell in waves past her shoulders when unbound. But her beauty was merely the visible part of something far more complex. Deline could read and write in English, French, and enough Latin to navigate legal documents. She could perform complex arithmetic in her head. She understood human psychology with the precision of a natural predator and could identify weakness and desire within minutes of meeting someone. And most dangerously, she possessed something that slavery was designed to destroy: an absolute, unwavering sense of her own intelligence and worth. Her history, pieced together from fragments she revealed strategically over time, told a story that was both common and unique in the strange world of pre-Civil War slavery. She had been born in New Orleans to an enslaved woman who was herself the daughter of a French merchant and his enslaved mistress. Deline had been raised in that merchant's household, educated alongside his legitimate children by tutors who were told she was a distant relative. She learned music, languages, literature, and arithmetic. She attended the opera, walked in gardens, and lived in luxury. Then the merchant died, and his legitimate heirs sold off the estate to settle debts. Everything was sold, including the enslaved people who had been treated almost as family. Deline found herself at 16 years old standing on an auction block. Her education and refinement served only to increase her price to men who saw in her something they could possess that would reflect their own sophistication and power. She had passed through several owners before James Whitmore. Each experience had taught her something valuable about the men who bought women like her. They wanted beauty, yes, but they also wanted the illusion of choice, the fantasy that what was forced was actually freely given. They wanted to believe themselves cultured and kind, not brutal. They wanted their power acknowledged but never named directly. And most of all, they wanted their secrets kept. Deline learned to give them these things, But she also learned to extract payment for what was taken from her. Not in currency that would be noticed, but in small accumulations of power that would matter later: information, access, the ability to read documents left carelessly on desks, the knowledge of which men drank too much, which men had gambling debts, which men had fathered children they could not acknowledge, which men were one scandal away from ruin. When James Whitmore brought her to his plantation, he installed her in the cabin he had prepared, gave her better clothing than any enslaved person on the estate, and ensured she received food from his own kitchen. He visited her 3 or 4 times a week, always after dark, always when the plantation had settled into sleep. He brought her gifts, books, because he knew she could read, jewelry which she was allowed to wear only in the cabin, fine fabrics, French perfume. He spoke to her as if they were confidants, telling her about his business frustrations, his social ambitions, his dislike for certain neighbors, his complicated feelings about his late wife. He seemed to believe that because Deline had no legal power, she represented no threat, that she was a container for his thoughts and desires, incapable of using what she learned. This was his first fatal mistake. Deline listened to everything. She remembered everything. And she began to build what would eventually become her insurance policy, her weapon, and ultimately her path to a form of freedom that James Whitmore could never have imagined. The other enslaved people on the Whitmore estate viewed Deline with mixed emotions. Some resented her privileges, the food she ate, the clothes she wore, the fact that she did not work in the suffocating rice fields or scrub floors in the main house. They saw her as complicit, as someone who had chosen comfort over solidarity. Others pitied her, understanding that what appeared as privilege was actually a different form of violation. That James Whitmore's visits were not gifts, but violence dressed in silk. But a few recognized something else. They saw the way Deline watched everything, how she asked careful questions, how she seemed to be collecting information the way others might collect shells on a beach. An older woman named Seraphina, who had served in the main house for 30 years and had seen multiple generations of Whitmores, approached Deline one evening as she drew water from the well. "You playing a dangerous game, girl?" Seraphina said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I seen women like you before, women who think they can outsmart masters. It never ends well." Deline met her eyes steadily. "And how does it end for women who don't play games, who simply endure? Do they fare any better?" Seraphina was quiet for a long moment. "No," she finally admitted. "I suppose they don't. Then I choose danger over helplessness. At least danger gives me something to work with." From that conversation, an unlikely alliance began to form. Seraphina understood the Whitmore household in ways that Deline, isolated in her cabin, could not. She knew which house servants could be trusted, which overseers were corrupt, which neighboring planters visited frequently, and why. She shared this information with Deline, not because she fully trusted her yet, but because she recognized intelligence when she saw it, and intelligence was a resource too valuable to waste. In return, Deline began to do small favors. When Seraphina's grandson was threatened with being sold to settle a debt James Whitmore owed, Deline mentioned to James in an unguarded moment how much she admired men who kept families together, how she found such loyalty attractive in a man's character. James, wanting to appear kind in her eyes, decided to keep the boy. When another house servant faced a whipping for a broken dish, Deline suggested to James that such violence disturbed her delicate sensibilities. The punishment was reduced. These were tiny interventions, barely visible ripples in the vast ocean of slavery's cruelties. But they mattered. They created loyalty. They established that Deline, despite her isolated position, could be useful to others. And they taught her something crucial. James Whitmore craved her approval, her admiration, her affection, even though he owned her legally and completely. This psychological need created leverage. By the fall of 1848, Deline had transformed her cabin into something unprecedented on the Whitmore estate. She had convinced James to allow her books from his library, claiming she wanted to improve her French to please him. He agreed, flattered by the request. She asked for writing materials to practice her penmanship. He provided them, amused by her dedication to self-improvement. What James did not realize was that Deline was studying law. She was reading property law, inheritance law, contract law, every legal text she could access. She was learning the precise boundaries of what was and was not permitted in South Carolina. What made legal documentation valid, what made a contract binding. She was educating herself in the very system that enslaved her, looking for cracks, for vulnerabilities, for ways that knowledge could become power. And she was writing. Every night by candlelight, she documented everything James told her. Every business deal, every debt, every grudge against his neighbors, every transgression, every secret. She wrote down the names of men who visited the plantation for purposes other than business. She noted dates, times, and circumstances. She recorded conversations she overheard when serving drinks at dinner parties James occasionally allowed her to attend, positioned as a decorative servant rather than guest, but close enough to hear everything. She was building an archive, a collection of truths that powerful men desperately needed to keep hidden. On a humid evening in late October, James arrived at Deline's cabin in an unusually agitated state. He poured himself whiskey from the decanter he kept there and drank it quickly, then poured another. "I have a problem," he said, not looking at her. "A significant financial problem." Deline waited, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of concerned attention. This was the pose she had perfected, beautiful, sympathetic, absolutely non-threatening. "I invested heavily in a shipping venture. Cotton to Liverpool. The ship was captured by pirates off the African coast. Complete loss. I owe substantial sums to several creditors, men who will not be patient about repayment." "How much do you owe?" Deline asked softly. James laughed bitterly. "Enough that I may have to sell portions of the estate. Field hands, perhaps even some of the rice land." He looked at her then, and his expression was complex. "I would never sell you," he said. "You understand that, don't you? Whatever happens, I would protect you." Deline felt ice in her stomach, but her face showed only gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "That gives me great comfort." But she understood immediately what his words actually meant. If James faced financial ruin, nothing would be protected. Everything would be sold, including her. His promise was worthless, built on the arrogant assumption that his desires would outweigh economic necessity. She had perhaps months, perhaps only weeks, before everything changed. That night, after James left, Deline made a decision. She would not wait for catastrophe. She would create her own leverage, her own security. She would transform from victim to architect of her own survival. She pulled out her hidden writings and began to organize them differently. Instead of a chronological journal, she began crafting individual documents, each one focused on a specific person, a specific secret, letters that appeared to be correspondence, but were actually carefully constructed insurance policies, each one detailing information that, if revealed, would destroy the subject's reputation, business, or family. And then she did something extraordinary. She began to write to these men directly. The first letter Deline sent was to a man named Marcus Ashford, one of Charleston's most respected attorneys, and a state legislator who visited the Whitmore plantation regularly under the pretense of discussing legal matters with James. What Marcus Ashford actually did during those visits was meet with one of the house servants, a young man named Samuel, in the small storage building behind the main house. This relationship, if discovered, would result in Ashford's immediate social destruction, possible criminal prosecution, and likely violence against Samuel. Deline had learned of this from Seraphina, who had learned it from her daughter, who cleaned the storage building and had once arrived early to find the two men together. The information had been kept secret within the enslaved community because exposing it would endanger Samuel, but Deline saw in it an opportunity that could benefit everyone involved if handled correctly. She wrote the letter carefully, making sure her handwriting could not be traced, using paper that James kept in his study and that she had taken one sheet at a time over several weeks. The letter was brief and precise. Mr. Ashford, I possess detailed knowledge of your visits to the Whitmore estate and the nature of your interest in one of its enslaved residents. I have no desire to expose this information, as doing so would harm someone I consider innocent of any wrongdoing. However, I require certain assurances for the future protection of both parties involved. If you are willing to discuss an arrangement that serves mutual interests, place a black ribbon on the gate post of St. Philip's Churchyard on Sunday next. If I see no ribbon, I will assume you prefer the matter to remain unaddressed, though I cannot guarantee others will not eventually discover what I know. A concerned party. She gave the letter to Seraphina, who gave it to her son, who worked as a delivery boy in Charleston and could slip it under Ashford's office door without attracting attention. Then Deline waited, her heart pounding with fear and exhilaration. She had crossed a line. If this went wrong, if Ashford reported the letter to James, she would be tortured to reveal her sources and then sold to the cruelest plantation her owner could find, or simply killed quietly and her body disposed of in the swamp. That Sunday, Deline convinced James to allow her to attend church services. She sometimes went with him, sitting in the balcony section reserved for enslaved people. Visible evidence of his piety in allowing even his servants to receive Christian instruction. From her position in the balcony, she could see St. Philip's Churchyard through the window. A black ribbon fluttered from the gate post. 2 days later, a response arrived through the same roundabout route. Ashford's letter was terse. State your terms. Deline wrote back with specific requests. First, Ashford would prepare manumission papers for Samuel, backdated and held in trust, to be filed immediately if anything happened to Samuel or if he faced being sold. Second, Ashford would establish a legal document declaring that a certain cabin on the Whitmore estate and all its contents belonged to a free woman of color named Deline Laurent, in payment for services rendered, also backdated to suggest a legitimate transaction. The document would remain unfiled but ready to be activated if necessary. Third, Ashford would provide Deline with information about Charleston's legal community, specifically which lawyers might be sympathetic to cases involving enslaved people and which judges could be influenced by scandal or pressure. In exchange, Deline would maintain absolute silence about Ashford's secret. Moreover, she would actively protect it, ensuring that no one else in the enslaved community spoke of what they knew. She would become his ally in maintaining the discretion that protected both Samuel and himself. Ashford agreed. He had no choice. Within 3 weeks, Deline possessed documents that, while not making her legally free, created the framework for potential freedom. More importantly, she had demonstrated that her strategy could work. She had transformed knowledge into leverage, had turned the vulnerability of a powerful white man into security for enslaved people. She repeated this pattern with 6 other men over the following year. A merchant who was embezzling from his business partners. A plantation owner who had forged documents to claim land that belonged to his brother. A banker who was conducting affairs with the wives of his clients. A minister whose sermons against sin concealed his own visits to Charleston's brothels. Each man received a letter. Each man made a choice to cooperate rather than risk exposure. Each man provided something valuable: legal documents, financial information, connections, protection. Deline was building a network, not of allies exactly, but of men whose self-interest aligned with her survival. The next morning, she was creating a web of mutual assured destruction where her death or disappearance would trigger the release of information that would destroy multiple powerful people. She made sure each man understood this. Her silence was valuable only if she remained alive, safe, and in control of her archive. But she was also doing something more subtle. She was redistributing small amounts of power back to the enslaved community. Through her interventions, families were kept together who would have been separated. Punishments were reduced or eliminated. A few people received small amounts of money that allowed them to purchase their own freedom. A young woman who had been targeted by an overseer was transferred to work in Charleston for a household that treated enslaved people less brutally. These actions made Deline a figure of legend among the enslaved population of the Lowcountry. Stories circulated about the beautiful woman in the cabin who somehow had the power to change white men's minds, who could prevent sales and punishments, who seemed to operate by rules that did not apply to anyone else. Some praised her as a guardian angel. Others feared her as someone trafficking with dark powers. The truth was more mundane and more remarkable. She was simply more intelligent and more ruthless than the men who thought they owned her. James Whitmore remained oblivious to all of this. He saw what he wanted to see: a beautiful, educated woman who seemed grateful for his protection and attentive to his needs. He believed he had created the perfect arrangement, had found someone who combined refinement with availability, who could discuss literature and philosophy while remaining completely under his control. His blindness would prove catastrophic. In the spring of 1849, James's financial situation worsened dramatically. The debts he had mentioned to Deline had grown, compounded by additional bad investments and a rice crop partially destroyed by unexpected flooding. Creditors were becoming insistent. James began selling property, first small parcels of land, then enslaved people he considered least essential to the plantation's operation. The atmosphere on the estate changed. Fear rippled through the quarters as families realized they might be separated, as people who had lived their entire lives in one place faced being sold to plantations in Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi, places so far away they might as well be different countries. The overseers became more brutal, as if violence could somehow stabilize a collapsing economic structure. One evening in April, James came to Deline's cabin and announced that he had received an offer from a Charleston gentleman named Beaumont Grayson. Grayson was wealthy, connected, and interested in acquiring certain specialized property from the Whitmore estate. James did not specify what property, but his meaning was clear. "Hay has offered $1,500, James said, avoiding Deline's eyes. "It would resolve a significant portion of my immediate debts." Deline felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her. This was the moment she had prepared for but had hoped would never come. "You told me you would never sell me?" she said quietly. "I said I would protect you," James replied, and now he looked at her directly. "Grayson is a gentleman. He would treat you well, better perhaps than I can at this point, given my circumstances. It would be a better situation for you." The rationalization was pathetic, but Deline recognized it for what it was: James convincing himself that his financial necessity was actually benevolence, that selling her was somehow an act of care. "When?" she asked. "The transaction would occur in 2 weeks. Grayson is currently in Columbia, but will return to Charleston on the 23rd. He would collect you then and settle the debt." After James left, Deline sat in her cabin, surrounded by the books, the furniture, the comfortable prison he had created, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in years: terror. Not the constant low-grade fear that was part of existing as an enslaved person, but acute, paralyzing terror that all her planning, all her careful construction of leverage, would be meaningless because she would be removed from the network she had built, transported to a new location where she would have to start over with no resources and no time, unless she acted immediately. Deline pulled out all her hidden documents and spread them across her table. She had letters implicating 7 men. She had legal papers prepared by Ashford that could theoretically establish her freedom, though they had never been tested in court. She had information about James Whitmore's finances that could destroy his remaining credit if revealed. And she had 2 weeks to transform all of this into actual salvation. She began writing letters, not to the men she had already ensnared, but to their associates, their business partners, their wives. She wrote to Beaumont Grayson himself, a letter that detailed certain financial improprieties of James Whitmore's that would make any property purchased from him potentially subject to creditor claims. She suggested that Grayson might want to reconsider any transactions until Whitmore's affairs were more thoroughly examined. She wrote to James's largest creditors, mentioning that she had personal knowledge of assets James had concealed from them, assets that could be seized to satisfy debts if they acted quickly. She provided just enough detail to be credible, but not enough to be easily verified, forcing them to investigate, creating chaos and pressure. And then she did something that would change everything. She sent a letter to the Charleston Mercury, one of the city's prominent newspapers. The letter, written anonymously, detailed a scandal involving multiple prominent Charleston gentlemen and their involvement in activities that violated both law and moral decency. It did not name specific names, but provided enough detail that anyone familiar with Charleston society would recognize the subjects. It suggested that more information existed and might be revealed if certain parties did not address their behavior. The letter created exactly the panic Deline intended. Charleston society, built on reputation and appearances, could not tolerate the threat of exposure. Men who had never met Deline suddenly had reason to ensure she remained silent, and that meant ensuring she remained alive and satisfied. Within a week, she received visitors, not at her cabin, which would have been too obvious, but through intermediaries. Serafina delivered messages. A visiting merchant passed a note while selling supplies to the plantation. A minister who came to preach to the enslaved population handed her a folded paper after his sermon. The messages all said essentially the same thing: name your price for silence. Deline's response was consistent: I want nothing except to remain where I am, undisturbed and safe. The day I am sold, moved, or harmed, all information I possess will be delivered to parties who will make it public. Guarantee my security, and I guarantee your secrets. For most of the men, this was acceptable. Their self-interest aligned with her survival. But there was one man for whom this arrangement was intolerable: Beaumont Grayson. Grayson was not one of the men Deline had documented. He had no secret she possessed, no vulnerability she could exploit. He was simply a wealthy man accustomed to acquiring what he wanted. And he wanted Deline. He had seen her once at a dinner party James hosted, had become fixated, and had spent months engineering an opportunity to purchase her. James's financial difficulties provided that opportunity, and Grayson was not accustomed to being thwarted by enslaved women, no matter how clever. When Grayson learned that the sale was being delayed, that James was suddenly reluctant to complete the transaction, he became suspicious. He began investigating, hiring people to ask questions, to track movements, to identify who might be interfering with his acquisition. And he was wealthy enough, connected enough, and persistent enough to eventually trace certain letters back to their source. On the night of May 19, 1849, Beaumont Grayson arrived at Whitmore Plantation unannounced, accompanied by 3 men he employed for purposes that were never officially stated but widely understood. They were enforcers, men who solved problems through violence and intimidation. James was not home, having traveled to Charleston for meetings with his creditors. The overseer, Taggart, was visiting his brother in Goose Creek. The plantation's usual structures of authority were temporarily absent, and Grayson had timed his visit to exploit that absence. He went directly to Deline's cabin. He did not knock. He simply pushed open the door and entered with his 3 companions, filling the small space with his presence and his threat. Deline was at her writing desk. She had been composing another letter, though to whom and about what she had not yet decided. She stood slowly, carefully, showing no fear, though her heart was racing. "Miss Deline," Grayson said, his voice carrying a false gentility that made his threat more explicit rather than less. "We need to discuss your recent correspondence?" "I don't know what you mean," Deline said. Grayson smiled without warmth. "Let us not insult each other with pretense. You have been writing letters? Letters that have interfered with a business transaction I arranged with Mr. Whitmore. Letters that have caused considerable inconvenience to several gentlemen of my acquaintance. This cannot continue. If letters have been written, they were not written by me. I am enslaved. I have no power to interfere with anything. And yet interference has occurred." Grayson moved closer. "Here is what will happen. You will give me whatever documents you have hidden here. You will tell me who has been helping you, who has been delivering your messages, who has been providing you with information. And then you will come with me to Charleston tonight, and we will complete the transaction Mr. Whitmore and I agreed upon. If you cooperate, this will be unpleasant but survivable. If you do not cooperate, my associates will make you cooperate, and the process will be significantly more painful." Deline calculated rapidly. The men with Grayson were large-armed and clearly experienced in violence. There was no physical escape. Screaming would bring no help. The other enslaved people would not dare interfere with white men, and the few white employees on the plantation at night would side with Grayson if they responded at all. Her only weapon was information, and Grayson was demanding she surrender it. She made a choice. "The documents are hidden," she said. "Not here. If anything happens to me, they will be found and distributed. But I can show you where they are if you give me your word that you will not harm me or anyone who helped me." Grayson considered this. "Show me the documents. Then we will discuss terms. The documents are in Charleston." Deline lied smoothly. "Hidden in a location only I can access. You will need to take me there. But we should travel during daylight so no one questions the journey. We can leave in the morning." It was a delaying tactic, desperate and probably futile, but it gave her hours she would not have otherwise. Grayson studied her face, searching for deception, but Deline had spent years perfecting the art of appearing truthful while lying. "We'll leave at dawn," Grayson finally said. "You will remain here under guard tonight. If you have lied to me, if the documents do not exist or cannot be retrieved, you will regret it profoundly." He left one of his men outside her cabin and departed with the others. Deline was trapped, monitored, her carefully constructed security collapsing around her. She had perhaps 10 hours to devise a plan that would save her life. She sat at her desk and began to write one final letter. This one would go to Marcus Ashford, the attorney whose secret she had protected and who owed her his career and possibly his life. The letter was simple: "I am in immediate danger. If I do not return to the Whitmore estate by tomorrow evening, you know what must be done. Release everything." She slipped the letter under the door, hoping the guard outside would not notice in the darkness. She watched it slide across the porch and prayed that Serafina, who often woke before dawn to start kitchen work, would find it and understand its urgency. Then Deline did something she had not done since childhood. She prayed, not to the Christian God that enslaving whites insisted was the only deity, but to the older gods, the ones her grandmother had whispered about, the ones that had survived the Middle Passage in the memories of people who refused to forget everything they had been before chains. She prayed to Urzuli, goddess of love and luxury and revenge. She prayed to Legba, opener of ways. She prayed to her own intelligence and courage, which seemed as divine as anything else in a world where survival required constant miracles. Outside, dawn approached, and with it, whatever fate Deline had written for herself, through years of careful manipulation and desperate courage. Serafina found the letter just as the sky was beginning to lighten from black to gray. She was walking toward the kitchen house when she saw the folded paper on Deline's porch, partially hidden under the edge of the steps. The guard Grayson had left was dozing against the wall, his head nodding forward. Serafina moved silently, a skill learned from decades of navigating white spaces where being noticed could be dangerous. She palmed the letter and continued walking as if nothing had occurred. In the kitchen house, away from any observers, she opened the letter and read it quickly. Serafina could read, though she hid this ability carefully. She had been taught by a previous Whitmore, an Anne of James's who had held peculiar ideas about education and Christian duty before dying of consumption 30 years earlier. Serafina had kept the skill secret, knowing that literacy was simultaneously valuable and dangerous for enslaved people in South Carolina, where teaching slaves to read had been illegal since 1834. She understood immediately that Deline was in crisis. She also understood that the letter needed to reach Charleston before Grayson took Deline there, or whatever leverage Deline possessed would be neutralized. Serafina called her son Thomas, who worked as a stable hand and often ran errands to Charleston. She gave him the letter and specific instructions: deliver it to Marcus Ashford's office before 8 o'clock. Tell no one. Come back immediately. Thomas left within minutes, riding one of the plantation's horses and carrying a forged pass that Serafina had learned to create over the years. The pass identified him as running an urgent errand for James Whitmore regarding legal matters. It would satisfy any patrol that might question an enslaved man traveling alone at dawn. While Thomas rode toward Charleston, Deline sat in her cabin, aware that the guard outside was now awake and alert. She could hear him shifting position, clearing his throat, checking his pistol. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed obscene in their beauty given the circumstances. Soon Grayson would return, and she would be forced to maintain her lie about documents hidden in Charleston, buying hours she might not be able to use effectively. But Deline had not survived this long by relying on single strategies. She had always maintained multiple plans, backup options, alternative routes to safety, and she had one more card to play, though it was dangerous and uncertain. James Whitmore was scheduled to return from Charleston that morning. If Deline could delay Grayson's departure long enough for James to arrive, she might be able to create a confrontation between the two men. James's vanity and possessiveness meant he would not appreciate Grayson taking Deline without his explicit permission, regardless of whatever agreement they had made. It was a slim hope based on one man's wounded pride overcoming another man's determination. But it was something. When Grayson arrived with his 3 companions at 7 o'clock, Deline was dressed and waiting. She had chosen her appearance carefully: simple clothing, hair bound back, no jewelry. She wanted to appear cooperative and unthreatening, giving Grayson no reason to rush or become suspicious. "Are you ready?" Grayson asked, his tone suggesting this was courtesy rather than genuine inquiry. "Yes." Deline said. But I should tell you that the location where the documents are hidden is not easy to access during morning hours. The building is a lawyer's office that does not open until 9 o'clock. We would need to arrive at precisely the right time to enter without attracting attention. This was partially true. Ashford's office did open at 9. Deline was betting that Grayson would prefer discretion over speed, that he would not want witnesses to whatever occurred when she could not produce the documents she had promised. Grayson's eyes narrowed. How convenient. Tell me, Miss Deline, do you take me for a fool? Not at all. I take you for a careful man who understands that forcing entry into a lawyer's office during business hours would create exactly the kind of attention that neither of us desires. If we time this correctly, I can retrieve what you want quietly and efficiently. Grayson studied her for a long moment. If you are attempting to delay, if you believe someone will rescue you, I assure you that no one is coming. You are property, and property disputes are settled between white men, not by white men on behalf of property. I understand that completely, Deline said, which is why I am cooperating. Grayson gestured to his men. We will wait here until 8. Then we depart for Charleston. If your documents are not where you claim, if this is deception, you will not enjoy the consequences. They settled into uncomfortable waiting. Grayson sat in the cabin's single chair while his men stood by the door and windows. Deline remained on the edge of her bed, her hands folded, her mind racing through possibilities and calculations. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to James's potential return, a minute closer to Ashford receiving her letter, a minute closer to either salvation or catastrophe. At 7:45, one of Grayson's men stepped outside and then returned quickly. Someone's coming. Carriage approaching from the main road. Grayson stood and looked out the window. Deline's heart accelerated. If this was James, if he had returned earlier than expected, the situation was about to change dramatically. The carriage came into view, and Deline recognized it immediately as James Whitmore's. He was returning from Charleston, though his timing seemed impossibly fortunate. Later, she would learn that Serafina had sent another message, this one to James's hotel in Charleston, claiming an emergency at the Plantation that required his immediate return. Serafina had gambled that James's need to maintain control of his property would override any other considerations. James emerged from the carriage, looking exhausted and irritated. He walked toward the main house, but stopped when he saw Grayson's horses tied near Deline's cabin. His expression transformed from irritation to anger. Mr. Grayson, James called out, his voice sharp. What are you doing on my property at this hour? Grayson stepped out of the cabin, his bearing confident. Completing our transaction, Whitmore. You sold me certain property. I am here to collect it. I sold nothing? James said, walking toward them. Our discussion was preliminary. No papers have been signed. No money has changed hands. You gave me your word, among gentlemen. That should be sufficient. James's face flushed. Deline recognized the signs of his temper rising. The same temper he usually controlled carefully, but that occasionally erupted when he felt his authority challenged. Among gentlemen, yes. But I am learning that you are no gentleman, Grayson. You come to my plantation without invitation. You enter buildings without permission. You presume to take my property without proper documentation. This is not how business is conducted. Your property, Grayson's voice was cold. You are drowning in debt, Whitmore. Everyone in Charleston knows it. You do not have the luxury of selective morality about how business is conducted. You need my money, and I want what I purchased. Get off my land, James said. No, before I have you removed. Grayson laughed. By whom? Your overseer is not here. Your field hands would not dare intervene in white men's business. You are alone, Whitmore, and you are weak. This was the moment when everything could collapse into violence. Deline saw James's hand move toward the pistol he kept in his coat. She saw Grayson's men shift their positions, readying themselves. She saw how quickly this could end in bloodshed that would accomplish nothing except ensuring she ended up as property of whoever survived. She stepped forward, moving between the two men. A slave woman inserting herself into a confrontation between white men, an action so transgressive that both James and Grayson turned to stare at her in shock. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm and clear, "perhaps there is a solution that serves everyone's interests. Be silent." James snapped. "This does not concern you. With respect, Mr. Whitmore, it concerns me entirely. I am apparently the subject of this dispute." She turned to Grayson. "You want to acquire me because you believe I possess information that threatens you. But that information's value lies in its potential revelation, not in its suppression. If you purchase me, you control me physically, but you do not control what I have already set in motion." Grayson's expression was dangerous. "Explain. Letters have already been written and placed with people I trust. If I disappear, if I am sold, if I am harmed, those letters will be delivered to their intended recipients. Your attempt to control me through ownership will fail, because the mechanism of revelation has already been established. Then I will simply kill you," Grayson said flatly. "Dead people cannot trigger anything. Dead people trigger everything?" Deline countered. "My death would be the signal for my associates to act. And unlike me, they have no reason to maintain silence once I am gone. You gain nothing from my death except the certainty of your own ruin." James was watching this exchange with growing comprehension. "What information?" he demanded. "What are you talking about?" Deline turned to him, and for the first time since arriving at his plantation, she allowed him to see her fully, not as the compliant, beautiful possession he had created, but as the intelligent, strategic survivor she had always been. "I have been documenting certain activities," she said. "Not just yours, though I know more about your financial situation than you might prefer, but also the activities of several prominent Charleston gentlemen who have secrets they wish to protect. Mr. Grayson is concerned that his association with some of these gentlemen might become public knowledge." James looked at Grayson. "What association?" "Nothing that concerns you," Grayson said tightly, but Deline continued. "Mr. Grayson has been purchasing enslaved people who have witnessed certain activities and then transporting them to plantations in Cuba where they can never testify about what they saw. He has been cleaning up evidence for men who engage in activities that South Carolina law prohibits. He has made himself indispensable to people who cannot afford exposure." The silence that followed was absolute. Grayson's face had gone white, then red. James was staring at both of them, trying to process information that reconfigured everything he thought he understood. "You are lying," Grayson finally said. "Am I?" "Then why are you here at dawn with armed men demanding to take an enslaved woman you supposedly purchased through proper channels? Why not simply arrive with documentation and collect your property through normal means?" "Because you know that I have evidence that threatens your entire operation." Grayson moved toward her, his hand reaching for her throat, but James stepped between them. Whatever else James Whitmore was, whatever cruelties he had committed or enabled, his possessiveness was absolute. No one touched what belonged to him without permission. "Touch her," James said quietly, "and I will kill you." "She is lying," Grayson repeated. "She is an enslaved woman spreading falsehoods to avoid being sold." "Perhaps," James said, "but she is my enslaved woman, and if she is spreading falsehoods, I will address it. You will leave now. Our transaction is canceled." Grayson looked between them, calculating. He was outnumbered in terms of local authority. James might be weak financially, but this was his land, his county. If violence erupted, the law would favor the local plantation owner over a Charleston merchant, regardless of the circumstances. And Deline's claims, whether true or false, had introduced doubt that could be dangerous. "This is not finished," Grayson said. "I will pursue satisfaction through proper channels." "I welcome it," James replied. "File whatever complaints you wish with whatever authorities you prefer, but leave my property now." The Grayson and his men departed, their horses kicking up dust as they rode toward the main road. James watched until they were out of sight, then turned to Deline with an expression she had never seen before, uncertainty mixed with something that might have been fear. "Come with me to the house," he said. "We need to talk." In James's study, with the door closed and no servants present, he poured himself bourbon, though it was not yet 9 in the morning. He drank it quickly, then poured another before speaking. "Tell me everything," he said. "Do not lie to me. I believe I have earned honesty at this point." Deline made a decision. She had gone too far to retreat into deception now. Either James would accept what she had done and find a way to accommodate it, or he would destroy her. There was no middle ground left. "I have been documenting information about various men," she said, "creating an archive of their secrets. I did this to protect myself, to ensure that I could not be easily sold or disposed of without consequences." "You blackmailed them." "I protected myself using the only resources available to me." "You call it blackmail. I call it survival." James sat heavily in his chair. "How many men?" 7 directly. Several others indirectly through their associations, including me, including you. He laughed, a sound without humor. "What do you have on me that I would fear? Your financial manipulations? The fact that you have been moving enslaved people off the estate books to hide them from creditors while still using their labor. The forged documents you used to claim your uncle's estate when his actual will specify different beneficiaries. The fact that you murdered your wife." The room went absolutely silent. James's face lost all color. "I did not murder Charlotte," he said, but his voice was hollow. "You gave her increased doses of laudanum over several months, slowly poisoning her while physicians attributed her decline to melancholia. You did this because she had discovered your financial frauds and threatened to inform her father, who would have destroyed you socially and financially. I found letters she wrote to her sister. Letters you thought you had burned. One survived, hidden inside a book in your library. I have it." James walked to the window, and stood there with his back to her for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Why tell me this now? You have just given me every reason to kill you." "Because we have reached a point where pretense is no longer useful to either of us. You cannot sell me because doing so will trigger the release of information that will destroy you. You cannot kill me for the same reason. But you also cannot continue as you have been, because I will no longer participate in the fiction that I am simply your property, grateful for your attention." "Then what do you propose?" "I propose an arrangement. You grant me legal manumission. You provide me with enough money to establish myself in a northern city. You give me the deed to this cabin and a portion of land around it so that I have something to sell if necessary. In exchange, I will give you all documents that pertain specifically to you. Your secrets die with me, but only if I am free and safe. And the other men, the ones you have documented, they remain bound to their own arrangements. Their secrets protect me even after I leave here. You benefit because I will be gone, no longer a daily reminder of your own weakness and crimes. I benefit because I survive and gain freedom. Both of us lose if either of us acts against the other." "You have orchestrated all of this," James said wonderingly. "From the moment you arrived here, you have been planning this." "From the moment I was born enslaved, I have been planning this." You and this plantation were simply the circumstances I had to work with. James sat again, his bourbon glass empty. You are extraordinary, he said. And terrifying. I am necessary, Deline corrected. I am what your system created when it enslaved people with intelligence and education, and then assumed they would remain passive tools. If I agree to this, how do I know you will keep your word? How do I know you will not reveal my secrets anyway, once you are free? For the same reason you know I have kept them until now, because my survival depends on the value of my silence. The moment I reveal what I know, I become useless and therefore vulnerable. But as long as powerful men need my discretion, I remain valuable and protected. This is not morality, Mr. Whitmore. This is mathematics. James studied her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. You never cared for me at all, did you? All of those evenings, all of those conversations, it was all performance. Deline could have lied to preserve his feelings, but she was done with that kind of mercy. No, she said simply. I did not care for you, but I made you believe I did because that was the price of survival. You wanted a doll that could speak and think, but remain obedient. I gave you that illusion while building my escape. The cruelty of this honesty seemed to wound him more deeply than any of her other revelations. He had wanted to believe that their arrangement, however unequal, had contained some element of genuine connection. Learning that it had been entirely fabricated, entirely strategic, apparently hurt more than learning she had been blackmailing him. When would you leave? He asked finally. Within a week. I need time to finalize certain arrangements and ensure that all parties understand the new circumstances. And you swear you will give me the documents about Charlotte, about the financial matters, about everything that concerns me directly. I swear it. On the same day I receive my manumission papers, properly filed and recorded. You will receive all documents that pertain to you. They will be bundled separately, clearly marked. You can destroy them however you wish. James poured himself another bourbon. Do it, he said. Arrange whatever needs to be arranged. I will contact Marcus Ashford today to begin the legal process. But Deline, if you betray this agreement, if you reveal anything after you are free, I will hunt you down regardless of the consequences. I will not die alone. I understand, Deline said, and I promise you, Mr. Whitmore, I have no desire to destroy you unless you give me no choice. My freedom is worth more to me than your ruin. She left his study and walked back to her cabin, her legs shaking with reaction to the confrontation she had just survived. She had gambled everything on James's fear outweighing his pride, and she had won. But the game was not over yet. She still needed to finalize arrangements with the other men, ensure her documents were properly secured, and navigate the complex process of actually leaving South Carolina as a newly freed woman of color, which came with its own dangers and restrictions. That afternoon, Thomas returned from Charleston with a message from Marcus Ashford. He would come to the plantation the following day to begin the legal proceedings. The letter also contained a warning. Beaumont Grayson had been asking questions about Ashford's client list and had suggested that certain lawyers might find themselves under investigation if they were discovered to be assisting slaves in illegal activities. The threat was clear. Grayson had not accepted defeat. He was attempting to cut off Deline's support network, to isolate her before moving against her again. She had perhaps days before he found a way to neutralize her protections. Deline sat in her cabin that evening, surrounded by her documents, her archive of secrets, the paper weapons she had forged from observation and intelligence. She had set liberation in motion, but she was not free yet. And Beaumont Grayson, unlike James Whitmore, was not a man whose pride could be manipulated or whose fear could be relied upon. He was a predator who had been thwarted, and predators did not stop hunting simply because their prey proved difficult to catch. The final confrontation was coming, and Deline needed to ensure she survived it. Marcus Ashford arrived at Whitmore Plantation on the morning of May 21, 1849, carrying a leather satchel filled with legal documents. He met with James in the study for over 2 hours, while Deline waited in her cabin, uncertain whether the meeting would result in her freedom or her destruction. When James finally summoned her, Ashford was still present, his expression professionally neutral. "The papers are being drawn up," James said without preamble. "Your manumission will be filed with Charleston County within 3 days. Mr. Ashford has agreed to handle the transaction and ensure all documentation is properly recorded. However, there is a complication." Deline's stomach tightened. "What complication?" Ashford spoke for the first time. "South Carolina law requires that any enslaved person granted freedom must leave the state within 1 year or risk being re-enslaved. Additionally, there are substantial taxes and fees associated with manumission designed to discourage the practice. Mr. Whitmore will need to pay approximately $400 in various charges to complete your freedom legally." $400 was a fortune. More than most free people of color earned in 2 years. Deline looked at James, who was studying papers on his desk to avoid meeting her eyes. "I will pay it," James said. "Consider it the final price of my own freedom from this arrangement. But understand, Deline, that once these papers are filed, you will have 1 year to leave South Carolina. If you remain beyond that time, you can be arrested and enslaved by anyone who claims you. The law is designed to ensure that free people of color do not establish themselves in this state." "I understand," Deline said. "I will leave within the month." "There is one more matter," Ashford interjected. "Mr. Beaumont Grayson has been making inquiries. He has suggested to several people that you may have been involved in illegal activities, specifically extortion and theft of documents from white citizens. If he can convince a magistrate to issue a warrant, you could be arrested before your manumission is finalized. At that point, the legal process becomes considerably more complicated." This was the danger Deline had anticipated. Grayson was trying to destroy her through legal mechanisms before she could escape his reach. "How long do I have before he can secure a warrant?" "Unknown. It depends on whether he can find a magistrate willing to act on accusations against an enslaved woman without substantial proof. Most judges would dismiss such claims as beneath their attention, but Grayson is well connected and persistent. You have days, possibly as much as a week, but not longer." Deline made a decision. "Then we move forward immediately. File the papers today. I will leave South Carolina as soon as the documents are recorded, even if it means departing before the week is out." Ashford nodded. "I will expedite everything possible. But Miss Deline, you should know that Mr. Grayson has also been investigating me. He knows about certain arrangements I have made on your behalf. If he exposes those arrangements, I could face disbarment and possibly criminal charges for aiding in what he would characterize as your extortion activities." "Who will not expose you?" Deline said with certainty. "Because doing so would require him to explain how he knows about our arrangements, which would lead to questions about his own activities. He is trapped by the same logic that traps everyone else in this web. Mutual assured destruction protects us all, as long as no one panics and breaks the pattern." Over the following 3 days, Deline worked frantically to finalize her escape. She met secretly with Seraphina and the other enslaved people who had helped her, explaining what was happening and ensuring they understood how to protect themselves after she left. She gave Seraphina a set of documents, carefully selected to contain information that could be used to protect the enslaved community, but nothing that would directly implicate them in Deline's activities. "These papers," Deline told Seraphina, contain evidence that certain white men have violated laws regarding enslaved people. If anyone in this community is threatened with being sold to particularly brutal circumstances, these documents can be used as leverage. Show them to the men named inside and suggest that their secrets could become public if they do not intervene on behalf of the person being threatened. Use this power carefully, only when absolutely necessary. Serafina took the documents with trembling hands. You are giving us a weapon. I am giving you the same weapon I used, information, carefully deployed. It will not end slavery. It will not make anyone truly free. But it might save a few lives, keep a few families together, reduce a few sufferings. That is all I can offer. It is more than anyone else has given us. Serafina said, May God protect you wherever you go. Deline also settled accounts with the 7 men she had documented. She met with each one, either in person through carefully arranged encounters or through intermediaries, and delivered the same message: her silence would continue as long as she remained alive, safe, and undisturbed. She provided each man with proof that documents still existed beyond what she was carrying, documents that would be released if anything happened to her. She was creating redundancy, ensuring that her protection outlasted her presence in South Carolina. On May 24, Marcus Ashford returned to the plantation with the completed manumission papers. They were elaborate documents filled with legal language and official seals, but the essential meaning was simple: Deline was no longer property. She was legally free, though hedged about with restrictions and obligations that demonstrated how thoroughly South Carolina feared free black people. James signed the papers without ceremony. He did not look at Deline during the process, as if by refusing to acknowledge her directly. He could pretend this was simply another business transaction, rather than the conclusion of a relationship that had defined 2 years of his life. In exchange, Deline delivered to him a sealed packet containing all documents that pertained specifically to his crimes, evidence of his wife's murder, records of his financial frauds, letters documenting his illegal concealment of enslaved people from creditors. James took the packet and immediately fed it into the fireplace in his study, watching the papers curl and blacken. We are concluded, then, he said, still not looking at her. We are concluded, Deline confirmed. I will leave tomorrow morning. That night, Deline packed her belongings. She had accumulated surprisingly little during her time at the plantation: a few dresses, some books James had given her, the writing desk that had been both her tool and her salvation. She packed carefully, knowing that everything she took needed to fit into the 2 bags she could carry, that her life was compressing down to what could be physically transported. She also burned documents, the copies she had kept of letters sent to various men, the drafts of correspondence, the notes and observations that had built her archive. She kept only the essential documents: her manumission papers, letters of introduction Ashford had prepared, and a small selection of papers that still provided leverage if she needed it. Everything else turned to ash, eliminating evidence that could be used against her. As she worked, she heard a knock on her cabin door. She opened it to find James, Whitmore's late wife's daughter, Anne, standing uncertainly on the porch. Anne was 13 years old, a shy girl who had always seemed uncomfortable with the plantation system, but lacked the power or courage to resist it. Miss Deline, Anne said quietly, I heard you were leaving. I wanted to say goodbye. Deline was surprised. Anne had never spoken to her before, except in the formal, distant manner expected between white children and enslaved adults. That is kind of you, Miss Anne. Is it true that you will be free? That you are really leaving? It is true. Anne looked down at her hands. I am glad. I do not think what Father did was right, keeping you here, making you... I am glad you are escaping. The girl's awareness, her moral discomfort, touched something in Deline, Miss Anne, can I give you some advice? Yes, please. When you are older, when you have power of your own, remember what you witnessed here. Remember that systems that give absolute power to some people over others create suffering and corruption. Whatever you do with your life, do not participate in such systems. Resist them where you can, refuse them where you must. Anne nodded solemnly. I will remember, I promise. After the girl left, Deline sat alone in the cabin, thinking about the strange conversation. Anne would grow up to inherit some portion of her father's wealth built on slavery. The girl's good intentions would likely dissolve when faced with the material benefits of participating in oppression. But, perhaps, Deline thought, perhaps Anne would be different. Perhaps witnessing Deline's resistance would plant a seed that would grow into something meaningful. It was a small hope, probably futile, but Deline had learned to find value in small hopes. At dawn on May 25, Deline left Whitmore Plantation for the final time. Ashford had arranged for a carriage to take her to Charleston, where she would board a ship heading north to Philadelphia. Several enslaved people came to see her off, including Seraphina, who embraced her with tears streaming down her face. Remember us, Seraphina whispered. Remember what you saw here. Tell people what slavery really is, not the lies they tell about happy servants and benevolent masters. I will remember, Deline promised. I will tell the truth. That is the only weapon I have left. The carriage journey to Charleston took 3 hours. Deline watched the landscape pass, the rice fields stretching endlessly, the moss-draped trees, the waterways that crisscrossed the low country like veins, carrying the lifeblood of the plantation economy. She was leaving this world, but it would never leave her. It was written into her bones, her memories, her understanding of human capacity for both cruelty and survival. In Charleston, Ashford met her at the docks. He had booked her passage on a merchant vessel leaving that afternoon. A ship captained by a Quaker who was willing to transport free people of color without excessive questioning or harassment. The passage cost $75, nearly all the money Deline had managed to save and acquire through her various arrangements. Once you reach Philadelphia, Ashford told her, contact the Anti-Slavery Society. They have people who help free people of color establish themselves. Find work, find housing, find safety. And Miss Deline, be careful. The Fugitive Slave Act means that even in northern states, people can be kidnapped and returned south. Keep your manumission papers with you always and trust no one completely. I learned that lesson years ago, Deline said. But thank you for the reminder, and for everything else. You could have refused to help me. You could have protected yourself by exposing me. You chose differently, and I am grateful. Ashford smiled sadly. You saved my life and Samuel's life. Helping you was the least I could do. But I also helped you because what you did was extraordinary. You turned nothing into something, powerlessness into power. You beat a system designed to destroy you. That deserves to be honored, even if it can never be publicly acknowledged. They said goodbye on the dock, and Deline boarded the ship. As it pulled away from Charleston, she stood at the rail and watched the city recede. She felt no triumph, no joy, only exhaustion and a strange emptiness. She had won, but the victory felt hollow. She was free, but 205 people remained enslaved at Whitmore Plantation. She had saved herself, but she had not changed the system. The ship sailed north, and Deline spent the voyage writing. She documented everything: the plantation system, the methods of control, the psychology of enslavers, the strategies of survival employed by enslaved people. She wrote about James Whitmore and Beaumont Grayson and all the other men who had believed their power made them invulnerable. She wrote about Seraphina and Thomas and Samuel and everyone else who had helped her escape. She was creating a record, a testimony that would survive even if she did not. But Deline's story was not over, because Beaumont Grayson had not given up. 3 days after Deline departed Charleston, Grayson discovered that she had been manumitted and had left South Carolina. His rage was apparently spectacular, resulting in property damage to his own office and threats against everyone he believed had assisted her. He demanded that authorities pursue her for theft and extortion, but his demands were met with bureaucratic indifference. Deline was legally free and had broken no laws that South Carolina courts recognized. Enslaved people blackmailing their owners was not a crime the legal system was designed to address, because acknowledging such cases would require admitting that enslaved people possessed the intelligence and agency to manipulate their masters. But Grayson was not constrained by legal niceties. He hired men to travel north, offering substantial rewards for information about a free woman of color matching Deline's description. He sent letters to contacts in Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, and Boston, describing her and suggesting that she had stolen property that needed to be recovered. He was attempting to create a network that would eventually locate her and bring her back south, legally or otherwise. Deline learned of this through the network she had established. Letters reached her in Philadelphia, forwarded through circuitous routes, warning her that Grayson was hunting her. She responded by disappearing. She changed her name, altered her appearance, and moved to a different city. She stopped writing letters to anyone in South Carolina, cutting all connections that could be traced. She became invisible in the way she had once been visible, using anonymity as a weapon instead of information. For 2 years Grayson searched, and then in the spring of 1851 he stopped. The reason became clear when news reached Philadelphia that Beaumont Grayson had been found dead in his Charleston office, killed by a single gunshot to the head. Authorities ruled it suicide, noting that Grayson had been facing significant financial difficulties and possible criminal charges related to his business practices. Some evidence suggested he had been engaged in illegal smuggling operations, transporting enslaved people to Cuba in violation of federal law. His death eliminated the primary witness to these activities, and the investigation quietly concluded. Deline learned of Grayson's death through a letter from Marcus Ashford. The letter said nothing explicit, but Deline understood the implication. The men whose secrets Grayson knew, the men he had been protecting and profiting from, had decided he had become more dangerous than useful. His persistent pursuit of Deline had drawn attention to their activities. His death solved multiple problems simultaneously. Whether Deline felt relief or horror at this news, she never recorded. But Grayson's death did not end her caution. She continued to live quietly, working as a seamstress, then as a teacher in a school for free black children. She avoided public attention, formed few close relationships, and kept her history largely secret. The trauma of enslavement and the years of strategic manipulation had left her unable to fully trust anyone, unable to believe in safety even when she had achieved it. In 1854, Deline married a free black man named Isaiah Miller, a carpenter who had purchased his own freedom 10 years earlier. They had one daughter, named Seraphina in honor of the woman who had helped Deline escape. Deline told her daughter stories about South Carolina, about the plantation, about the people who had remained enslaved when she gained freedom. She wanted Seraphina to understand that her mother's freedom had been purchased not just with intelligence and courage, but with the suffering of others who did not escape. When the Civil War began in 1861, Deline was 33 years old and living in Boston. She worked with freed people who fled north during the war, helping them navigate the complex process of establishing new lives. She used the skills she had learned during enslavement, the ability to read situations and people, to manipulate systems, to find leverage in powerless positions. But now she used these skills to help others rather than just herself. She also testified when abolitionists asked her to speak about her experiences. She agreed, though she never revealed the full extent of what she had done to escape. She described the plantation system, the methods of control, the psychological violence that accompanied physical bondage. She spoke about James Whitmore without naming him, describing a man who convinced himself that his desire constituted consent, that his provision of comfort justified his violation. She wanted people to understand that slavery corrupted everyone it touched, that even men who prided themselves on being cultured and educated could commit monstrous acts when given absolute power over other human beings. DeLine lived until 1889, dying at age 61 from pneumonia. She was buried in a cemetery in Boston, her grave marked with her married name, giving no indication of the extraordinary life she had lived. Her daughter inherited her papers, including the documents DeLine had carried north, and eventually donated them to a historical society, where they sat largely unexamined for decades. But what happened to the cabin? The beautiful cabin that had been both prison and fortress, where DeLine had constructed her weapons from words and observation. After DeLine left, James Whitmore never entered the cabin again. He ordered it locked and abandoned, as if the space itself had become contaminated by her resistance. The cabin remained standing for decades, slowly deteriorating, while the plantation changed ownership multiple times. During the Civil War, Union troops occupied the property briefly, and soldiers reported seeing the strange isolated cabin with glass windows and decorative ironwork, so unlike the other slave dwellings that it seemed to belong to a different world. After the war, during Reconstruction, formerly enslaved people on the Whitmore estate told stories about the cabin and the woman who had lived there. The stories became legendary, growing with each retelling. Some said DeLine had been a conjure woman who had cursed James Whitmore. Others said she had made a deal with the devil for her freedom. Some claimed she had murdered her owner and escaped justice through witchcraft. The truth was both simpler and more remarkable than any legend. She had been an intelligent woman who refused to be destroyed and who used the only weapons available to her. In the early 20th century, the Whitmore estate was subdivided and sold. The main house was demolished. The rice fields were abandoned to swamps and forest. But the cabin remained, preserved by its isolation and by local superstition that made people reluctant to disturb it. It became a local curiosity, the fancy slave cabin, that contradicted tourist narratives about slavery being a benign paternalistic system. In 1983, the property was purchased by a historical preservation society that planned to develop it as an educational site about low-country plantation life. Researchers began examining the existing structures, including the mysterious cabin. What they found inside changed historical understanding of slavery in profound ways. The cabin's floor had been carefully constructed with false boards that created hidden compartments. When these compartments were discovered and carefully opened, researchers found documents that had been hidden there for over a century: letters, ledgers, legal papers, all documenting the lives and crimes of prominent Charleston families. Some of the documents proved financial frauds. Others revealed relationships and arrangements that violated law and social norms. A few documented violence against enslaved people that had never been prosecuted or even acknowledged. But most significant was a leather-bound journal written in 3 languages. The journal's author identified herself only as D, and she documented her enslavement at what was clearly the Whitmore plantation. But unlike most slave narratives, which focused on suffering and eventual escape, this journal was a manual. It explained how to gather information, how to identify vulnerabilities in white owners and their associates, how to create leverage from powerlessness, how to construct networks of mutual protection, how to survive with dignity and intelligence in a system designed to destroy both. The journal became known as the Deline document, though researchers debated for years whether that was actually her name or a pseudonym. It was revolutionary in its implications because it demonstrated that enslaved people were not simply victims enduring suffering until white abolitionists freed them. Some were active resistors, strategic thinkers, people who fought back using psychological warfare and information control when physical resistance was impossible. The documents were initially sealed by court order at the request of descendants of the families named in the papers. They argued that revealing century-old scandals would constitute unfair damage to their reputations. The case went through various legal challenges for 24 years before the documents were finally made fully public in 2007. When historians began analyzing the complete archive, they pieced together Deline's full story. They identified James Whitmore through property records and death certificates. They tracked Beaumont Grayson's business dealings and suspicious death. They found Marcus Ashford's legal filings and connected them to Deline's manumission. They discovered that several prominent Charleston families had been paying annual sums to an unnamed free woman of color for decades after the Civil War. Payments that continued until her death in 1889. Payments that seemed designed to maintain someone's silence. The discovery reshaped historical understanding of slavery in several ways. It demonstrated that enslaved people's resistance took forms far more sophisticated than previously acknowledged. It showed that the system of slavery was more fragile than enslavers wanted to admit. Vulnerable to intelligent opposition, even from people with no legal power. And it proved that some enslaved people survived not through submission or good fortune, but through strategic brilliance and calculated manipulation of the very people who claimed to own them. The cabin was eventually restored and opened to the public as part of a museum dedicated to telling more complete and honest histories of slavery. Visitors walk through the small space and see the decorative ironwork, the glass windows, the furniture that seems too refined for a slave dwelling. They learn about Deline and how she transformed this cabin from a prison into an intelligence headquarters, how she weaponized beauty and education and observation into tools of survival. Tour guides explain that the cabin represents something uncomfortable, but important, that slavery was not simply a system of physical brutality, though it was certainly that. It was also a system of sexual violence, psychological manipulation, and complex power dynamics that enslaved people navigated with varying degrees of success. Some survived through submission, others through resistance, and some, like Deline, through a combination of apparent cooperation and hidden defiance. If you want to explore more stories like this, stories about resistance and survival that challenge comfortable narratives about American history, consider subscribing. We dig into the archives that institutions wanted to keep sealed, uncover the voices that were deliberately silenced, and tell the stories they never wanted you to hear. These histories are uncomfortable, but understanding them is essential for understanding how we got here and where we need to go. The Deline document itself remains in climate-controlled storage at the Charleston Historical Society, though portions have been digitized and made available online. Scholars continue to study it, finding new layers of meaning and strategy. Some historians have noted that Deline's methods, her use of information as currency and leverage, her creation of networks based on mutual interest rather than trust, her strategic deployment of truth and silence, these strategies anticipated modern intelligence operations by decades. She was not a spy in any formal sense, but she understood intelligence tradecraft instinctively, learned it through necessity, and perfected it through practice. She demonstrated that the powerless are not helpless, that intelligence can sometimes triumph over structural violence, and that survival itself can be a form of resistance. But there is darkness in this story too. Darkness we need to acknowledge. Deline saved herself by making deals with evil men, by protecting their secrets, by prioritizing her own survival over broader justice. She used information about crimes and abuses as bargaining chips, rather than exposing them to destroy the system. In this way, she participated in maintaining the silence that allowed slavery to continue, even as she personally escaped it. This moral complexity is important. Deline was not a hero in the simple sense. She was a survivor who made impossible choices in an impossible situation. She used the only tools available to her, and those tools required collaboration with people whose secrets should have been exposed, whose crimes should have been punished. But judgment is easy from a position of freedom. What would any of us do if our choices were enslavement or compromise? Who among us can honestly say we would choose differently? The cabin stands today as a testament to human resilience and human complexity. It reminds us that resistance takes many forms, that survival strategies can be as sophisticated as any military campaign, and that the people we were taught to view as passive victims were actually active agents in their own stories, making choices and creating possibilities within brutal constraints. But it also reminds us that slavery corrupted everything it touched. Deline's brilliance was forged in hell. Her strategic genius was a response to being treated as property. The skills that saved her should never have been necessary, because the system that required them should never have existed. Her survival was a victory, but it was a victory that left scars. That came at terrible cost. That required sacrifices and compromises that haunted her for the rest of her life. The most haunting item found in that cabin was a small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside were locks of hair tied with different colored ribbons. Research suggested these were from other enslaved people on the plantation. People Deline had known, people who had remained behind when she escaped. Each lock was labeled with a name and a date. It was a memorial, a way of remembering people who would never be officially remembered, whose names would never appear in histories, whose lives would be forgotten by everyone except this one woman who refused to forget. This is what slavery did. It created situations where the only way to survive was to leave others behind, where saving yourself meant accepting that others would not be saved, where freedom came with guilt because it was partial, individual, incomplete. Deline carried that guilt for 40 years after her escape. The locks of hair in the wooden box prove she never forgot the price of her freedom, never stopped mourning the people she could not save. And perhaps that is the real lesson of the cabin. The true reason we need to tell this story. We need to remember not just the brilliance of Deline's escape, but also the tragedy that her escape was necessary, that her intelligence was forged in bondage, that her survival required skills no one should need to develop. We need to honor her while also acknowledging the horror of the system that created her story. The cabin remains standing because it tells truths that architecture cannot lie about. You cannot look at those glass windows, that decorative iron, that furniture, and maintain comfortable fictions about slavery being a simple matter of field labor and ignorant workers. The cabin forces confrontation with the reality that slavery encompassed sexual violence, that it created complex power dynamics, that it involved sophisticated forms of control and resistance that rarely appear in sanitized historical accounts. What they discovered inside South Carolina's most beautiful slave woman's cabin was not treasure or luxury. They discovered evidence of a war fought with words and information instead of weapons. They discovered proof that enslaved people were far more than the system tried to reduce them to. And they discovered a truth that remains uncomfortable even now, that survival in evil systems sometimes requires compromise with evil, and that we cannot judge those compromises from positions of safety that victims never enjoyed. Deline's story is not a happy story. It is a story of survival, resistance, intelligence, courage, compromise, guilt, and unhealed trauma. It is a story that complicates our understanding of slavery while also deepening it. It demands that we see enslaved people as fully human, which means seeing them as complex, strategic, morally ambiguous, capable of both extraordinary courage and painful compromise. The cabin stands as a memorial to that complexity. And as long as it stands, Deline's voice continues to speak across centuries, reminding us that the people who were written out of history were never silent. They were simply unheard, until now.